still had an apartment in Stuyvesant Town, but which we weren't going to occupy. The lease had 2 more years to go. They had 3-year leases at that day. So when we went to Penn State, we invited the Hendrickses to live in our apartment as guests. It's often referred to by saying we sublet it, but that wasn't the case. The Hendrickses couldn't give up their Harlem apartment because they never knew when they might get kicked out of Stuyvesant Town the next day. So they were there. We continued to pay the rent. They were guests. And then when we went down to Penn State, we found a place to live. The head of the math department, me street, the train station. Grace and Alice hadn't come yet. They were going to come after I got a little settled. I asked her, what do we do now? She said, we go to the president's office. I didn't even have a place to sleep that night. So we go over. It was actually an acting president at that time. And it wasn't a social call. As he explained it to me, he'd been getting, this story that had a family moving into our flat had been in the papers. As he put it, he said, a number of our wealthy alumni have been phoning, wanting to know why the hell you'd been hired and how quickly you could be fired. This is academic freedom in the U.S. Somehow or other we placated him. And I went there, found a place to sleep. We found an apartment, a house, and they came up, and things were going along fairly well. And then, I guess it was early April, after some months had elapsed, I get called in the president's office. The department head and the dean are also there. Well, actually, we met in the dean's office. The acting president came over, and the department head brought me there. And the acting president said, you know, the board of trustees has asked me for a report on you. I gave them a report. I said you were active professionally and that you got on well with your colleagues and your teaching was satisfactory. Then they said to me, that's not what we're interested in. And they've given me a list of questions to put to you. And it started, would I be willing to give up my apartment in Stuyvesant Town? And they didn't. I said, well, I can't do that. I've got people living there, can't throw them out on the street. Well, will you be willing to give up the apartment when your lease expires? Not if the fight isn't over. And things went from bad to worse after that. And I said, are you a communist? I said, well, you know, I'd like to ask you to reconsider that question because there's no legislation in Pennsylvania which authorizes political questions of faculty members. And this is a hot issue nationally, both in New York and California, both ends of the country. Our colleagues are engaged in big fights against legislation of this nature, which has been proposed and is under discussion, hasn't been enacted. Should we have the responsibility of pulling the rug out from under our colleagues? He just got mad and left at that point. He didn't insist on an answer or withdraw the question. I'd asked him to withdraw it because of consideration. A week later, I got a one-sentence letter, your appointment will not be renewed. So then, of course, I let Paul Ross, the chair of our committee, I still had kept a vice chairmanship, and he had, from his days as a big shot in the city administration, had good contacts in the New York Times, and he called one guy there, and there was a story on the front page of the New York Times. I think it was April 10th, 1950, saying that I'd been fired and quoting some of the things which were involved. The acting president had, with Pennsylvania love for private property, had said that what I had done was illegal, immoral, and damaging to the public relations of the college. Well, that he was quoted to in the Times to that effect. And the next day, the Times had an editorial calling on Penn State to reconsider. That was quite unusual. I think they were usually pontificating without dealing with specific issues. And but New York City was a big black population, and the Times had to be sensitive to that as well. So that, well, of course, the dismissal stuck. I'll tell you a little more about that in a moment if you're still interested. But in Penn State, of course, is a small town. State College was the name of the town. You know, all that was there was the college. It wasn't even a liquor store. It was illegal to sell liquor. And I ran into the acting president while we were shopping for groceries for our respective families. And he said, "You know, I've learned a lot from this fight." I said, "Namely?" He said, I learned something about some of the colleagues here. He said, "You know, the department head came to me and offered to withdraw his recommendation for your reappointment after I wrote you that you weren't going to be reappointed." He said, "But he said, I'm not, I want to be honest." He said, I wouldn't let him do it. Funny, of course, it didn't have any effect, but it kind of surprised him that people would shift gears so quickly. And now, Einstein saw the story in the New York Times and asked me to come visit him in Princeton to discuss the matter, which I did. I had a very pleasant afternoon in his home, just the two of us. He quizzed me on the details of what had happened. He was too wise to just believe a newspaper account. He wanted to hear it directly. And then we discussed the state of the world for a while after that. He was particularly interested not in something the Times hadn't published. The Times hadn't included the communist issue in the account. But he was very sensitive to that because of his experience in Germany. You know, the first people put in concentration camps there were not Jews, they were communists. And so when he praised me for having resisted that question, and that I'd done it in the right way. And then he wrote a letter to the authorities at Penn State and gave me a copy of it, calling on them to support me and not dump me. It was a very lovely letter. There were people who commented that it was almost worth getting fired to have Einstein say such nice things about me. This was, of course, I've treasured that letter over the years, and I didn't, he had it written, he wrote it while I was there and gave it to me to take back. So I delivered it by hand to the office of the president. It wasn't going to get lost in the mail. So that was Penn State. One of the people who had been very active in the Stuyvesant Town issue and who had been particularly vocal on the whole question of racism in New York was, I think, the first black judge, Hubert Delaney, the domestic relations court, and we'd become friendly through the Stuyvesant Town thing. And through his intervention, I was given a job at Fisk University in Nashville, Tennessee, a historically black institution. And it was a last-minute thing. I had been offered several Canadian jobs, and Alice was busy. One I remember most prominently was University of Saskatchewan in Saskatoon, and Alice was busy reading the encyclopedia about Saskatoon, where we were going. She was the local expert on Saskatoon. On that, and then, well, but the Fisk job came through, more or less a last-minute thing. I took it. That was September 1950. And just prior to the opening of the school year, the International Congress of Mathematicians was held. It was a quadrennial affair, and it happened that it was going to be at Harvard and MIT. That time floated from country to country. Now, 1950 was already a time when the U.S. government was beating the Cold War drums very loudly. Every time there was an effort by the Soviet Union to make an accommodation, the U.S. government announced what they called a peace offensive. And the petitions that were going around at that time, it was a very hot time when they were mobilized, because the American people were not so sold on the Cold War at the beginning. It took them a lot of stuff, a lot of hysteria, a lot of publicity, a lot of pressure to bring about the kind of support which they later got for the Cold War. Well, the International Congress of Mathematicians, I said, was a quadrennial affair, but of course it hadn't been held during the war. So the way it worked out was that this was the first Congress since 1936. So it was going to be a really big thing, and it was. And the honorary president of the Congress was Jacques Adamar, a French mathematician, an icon of modern mathematics, who had been lucky enough to be out of France during the war. He'd been lecturing in the U.S. when the war started and simply stayed. And then at the end of the war, he went back home. As I say, he was a gigantic figure and had already been designated as honorary president of the Congress. And a left-wing young French mathematician, Lorch, had been among the people who was going to get a prize at this Congress for research. The U.S. government denied them visas. And of course, that was something that was going to cause a lot of noise. And there was. I heard at the time, I never checked it out, that Canada had offered to take over the Congress with the guarantee that everybody would get visas. That is quite likely true. And of course, if Congress had been removed from the U.S., that would have been a big diplomatic defeat for the U.S. authorities in their Cold War program. So, and also, the rest of the French delegation had said they wouldn't come unless Adamar and Schwartz could come. So they threw in the towel, sort of. They gave them visas, but visas valid only for 30 miles around Cambridge, Massachusetts, so they could be there for the Congress. They wouldn't even allow Adamar to transit through the U.S. to go to Mexico to give some post-Congress lectures there, to which he'd been invited. Now, he was 85 years old at the time. All this was going on, but he was in good health, a little bird-like man. And I ran into him in the corridor one day. He was alone, I was alone, and I was only 35 at the time, so I didn't mind much what I said to anybody. I said to Adama, I hope you won't think me presumptuous if I tell you what your greatest accomplishment is. Oh, he saw it was going to be a joke, and he smiled and said, go ahead. I said, to be at age 85 such a menace to this great country. he laughed his head off at that. So, Adama, I don't think Adama was actually a member of the Communist Party of France, but he had occasionally spoken at its meetings, and he did not hesitate to identify himself with their program. So this is why the U.S. was anxious not to have him around. So that was the week or two after that was when we went to Nashville, so big 5 years at Fisk University, where Alice was to play quite a role.